Japan built one of the longest bridge systems on Earth without the city waiting on the other side, without tourists, without industry, and without any obvious economic purpose. Against all odds, the project was never cancelled. What they don't tell you is what the bridge was actually carrying across kilometers of open ocean water. From the air, the structure looks impossible. Twin towers rise more than 200 meters above the strait. Cables sweep between them in perfect catenary curves, holding a deck that stretches for kilometers over deep water. Surveyors once refused to publish the depth readings, and at the far end, where the roadway touches land, there is almost nothing. A small harbor, a few dozen houses, a road curving inland, then simply ending. The answer isn't tourism, it's something far stranger, and the truth begins with a map of Japan. The Japanese archipelago is not one country, but nearly 7,000 islands strung along the western Pacific edge. Only about 400 of them are inhabited. Many hold fewer than 100 people. Some hold none. For most of the 20th century, these outer islands were treated as afterthoughts by planners and policymakers alike. They received mail by boat once weekly. Their children left for the mainland and almost never returned home. Their fisheries emptied, their schools closed. Entire villages faded quietly into the surrounding forests and salt-worn coastlines. And yet, beginning in the late 1960s, Japan's government began drawing bold new lines on maps. Lines that connected the mainland to those forgotten islands. Not with ferries, with bridges of unprecedented scale. Steel bridges of a scale the world had never attempted before. The plan was called Island Connectivity. The public was told it was about equal opportunity, about lifting isolated communities into the modern economy. The numbers, however, told a completely different story.
Engineers estimated the total lifetime traffic would be shockingly low. Less than a single Tokyo intersection sees in one afternoon, for a bridge spanning kilometers of ocean. So what were these bridges really built for? Subscribe to keep exploring how our modern world is quietly engineered. The costs were staggering. A single suspension span could consume $5 billion United States dollars in today's money. Materials had to be sourced from 3 continents. Construction crews numbering the tens of thousands of workers. The population being served, in some cases, numbered only in the hundreds. Officially, this was a national infrastructure gamble. Behind closed doors, it was framed as something else entirely. Because the first proposal was quietly rejected, twice. The first rejection came in 1971. Economists reviewed the traffic forecast and returned a one-word verdict: unjustifiable.
The second rejection came 4 years later, when environmental engineers warned about the currents in the strait. They said the currents would tear apart any conventional pier design. Both times, the project was shelved. Both times, it returned within 18 months, with new sponsors, new arguments, and a slightly redrawn route. To understand why, look at post-war Japan. After 1945, the country rebuilt itself around a single national promise. No citizen, no matter how remote, would be left behind by the industrial miracle. Not mere political language. It was a founding principle of a reconstruction state. Roads reached every valley. Rail lines climbed every mountain. Telephones arrived in villages that had never seen electricity. Connectivity itself became a form of national identity. By the 1970s, one thing remained unresolved: the islands. The Prime Minister made a public commitment.
Every Japanese citizen would live within reach of the national highway network by the end of the century. Economists warned that the last kilometers of that promise would cost more than the first 1,000. They were correct. And yet planning accelerated regardless. Depopulation curves were ignored. Cost-benefit ratios were quietly rewritten to justify continuing. Whole ministries were reorganized to move the project forward, no matter what the numbers on paper actually said. But here's the thing. If moving villagers was the real goal, ferries would have been cheaper by 100-fold. A modern, high-speed catamaran could serve every island community for less than the interest on a single bridge loan. The engineers knew this. The politicians knew this. The islanders said so publicly, on the record, in hearings. And yet the bridges kept advancing. The bridge's true purpose lay hidden, quietly, beneath the ocean seabed. Before we reach that purpose, we must understand what these engineers were fighting against in this hostile place. The physics of building in this part of the world are among the most hostile on Earth today. Japan sits at the intersection of 4 tectonic plates, a rare and violent geological crossroads on our planet. The Pacific plate slides beneath it at nearly 8 centimeters per year, the fastest subduction in the developed world.
Every point along this coast is, statistically, overdue for a great earthquake of catastrophic and civilization-shaking magnitude. The design brief required these bridges to survive ground accelerations exceeding 1 full gravity, shaking violently yet remaining standing. Then there is the wind. The straits sit directly in the path of a Western Pacific typhoon corridor. Sustained winds during a strong storm can exceed 70 meters per second, roughly 250 kilometers per hour. A suspension bridge deck, if built naively, would twist in such wind like a ribbon and tear itself apart. Engineers had already witnessed this catastrophe elsewhere. The ghost of Tacoma Narrows haunted every Japanese engineering school. The 1940 failure in the United States was studied obsessively. Every design that followed had to answer Tacoma. Then there is the water itself. The straits between these islands are unusually deep, dropping past 60 meters below. Below the seabed lies not bedrock, but volcanic sediment, unstable, saturated, and dangerously prone to liquefaction under load. To anchor a tower, engineers had to build enormous steel and concrete caissons, each the size of a stadium. Each caisson was floated from a shipyard, positioned by tugboats, and sunk with the precision of a watchmaker. Once on the bottom, the caisson was filled with concrete pumped through pipes lowered from the surface above. Some of these foundations weigh more than 150,000 tons, heavier than an aircraft carrier. The choice between a suspension bridge and a cable-stayed bridge quickly became a fierce national engineering debate. Suspension bridges can span longer distances, but they demand massive anchor blocks embedded deep into each shore. Cable-stayed bridges are more efficient over shorter distances, but they transfer huge compressive loads directly into their towers. For the longest crossings, suspension won.
For the medium spans, cable-stayed dominated the final design decisions. Each choice was defended in academic journals with the intensity of a religious argument between rival schools. And then there was corrosion, the slow, invisible enemy of every steel structure built above the open sea. Saltwater fog, driven by relentless wind, coats every surface of a marine bridge in a thin brine film. Ordinary steel would rust through in less than a decade, collapsing under its own weight before completion. Japanese metallurgists developed new alloys, coatings, and dehumidification systems, pushing cable life from 20 years past 100. Some cables are now dehumidified from the inside with dry air pumped through the strands 24 hours a day. But the physics, in the end, turned out to be the easy part of the entire undertaking. The real story of these bridges is not engineering, it is strategy. And here the naive version collapses. The public was told these bridges were built for the villagers, for the elderly farmer reaching a distant hospital, for the school child who could now reach a high school on the mainland. Those stories were true, but insufficient. They could not on their own justify the numbers. The real reason is maritime. a matter of national survival. In the late 20th century, control of the seas around Japan became a matter of economic and strategic survival. Japan imports over 90% of its energy. Nearly all of it arrives by ship through narrow ocean choke points. Every barrel of oil, every ton of coal, every cubic meter of liquefied natural gas passes those outer straits. Close those straits by hostile power, natural disaster, or diplomatic incident, and Japan's entire economy collapses within weeks. The bridges and the roads they carried gave the state something it did not previously have: physical presence. A permanent, undeniable, legal presence on islands whose ownership might otherwise be contested by a rival maritime power. Under international maritime law, a nation's exclusive economic zone extends 200 nautical miles from its shore. That includes fishing rights, seabed mineral rights, and offshore energy rights. Enormous national wealth locked within that boundary. But those rights depend on the island being inhabited, administered, and physically connected to the nation-state itself. An empty rock is a weak claim. An empty rock with a bridge and highway becomes something else entirely. A bridge, highway, coast guard station, and population register together form an ironclad permanent claim on the sea. Imagine if a single bridge could extend a country's economic zone by tens of thousands of square kilometers. Imagine if that same bridge could guarantee exclusive access to fishing grounds worth billions of dollars every year. Imagine if it quietly enabled the deployment of radar, communications equipment, and defensive assets to otherwise indefensible islands. That is what these bridges were actually carrying. The timing tells the story of Cold War strategic ambition. The most ambitious of these projects were greenlit during the sharpest, most dangerous years of the Cold War. Soviet submarine activity in the Western Pacific was at its peak.
Chinese naval capacity was beginning to grow. American forces stationed in Japan required rapid overland movement between the scattered southern islands of the archipelago. Every strategic study of the era concluded the same thing. Whoever controlled the outer islands controlled the lanes. Whoever controlled the shipping lanes controlled the economy. The bridges were sovereignty rendered in cold hard steel, and the cost overruns were only beginning. The 1980s transformed the projects again in dramatic fashion. Japan's asset price bubble sent the value of land, labor, and materials spiraling relentlessly upward year after year. Budgets that had been set in the mid-70s were entirely unrecognizable by the arrival of 1988. Contractors flush with cash demanded premium rates. Politicians, flush with generous donations, quietly granted every single one.
A series of scandals erupted around the selection of construction consortia awarded these enormous public infrastructure contracts. Prosecutors traced the payments, resignations followed, and in some cases, senior cabinet ministers stepped down in disgrace. And yet, against all odds, the bridges continued rising above the strait, indifferent to the political storm. Then came January 1995. The Great Hanshin earthquake struck the city of Kobe with devastating force. Seismic waves reached areas already covered in scaffolding. Bridges under construction did not collapse, but movements exceeded design assumptions. Every ongoing project was halted. Every completed component was re-inspected. New seismic codes were issued within months. Foundations were retrofitted. Deck sections were reinforced. Cable anchorages were redesigned. The delays added years. The costs added billions. Environmental groups, meanwhile, had begun a coordinated campaign. The caissons, they argued, disrupted tidal flows and marine ecosystems. The construction dredging destroyed fish nurseries. The bridge lighting confused migrating birds. Court cases were filed. Some succeeded. Design changes were mandated. New underwater surveys were required. Additional environmental monitoring stations rose along the storm-battered coasts. Every objection extended the timeline. And yet, the timeline extended without cancellation. The political consensus somehow held firm. By the mid-1990s, some of these projects had been under active planning or construction for 20 years. The original engineers were retiring. The original politicians were dead. A new generation inherited the drawings, debts, and doubts.
In many ministries, insiders privately called the projects the inheritance, something you did not choose but could not refuse. Then, one engineering test nearly ended everything. What they don't tell you is how close it came to failure. In the late 1990s, a scale model of a completed bridge deck entered a massive wind tunnel. Engineers wanted to verify their aerodynamic assumptions matched reality. They increased the wind speed slowly and carefully. At the equivalent of 40 meters per second, nothing happened. At 50 meters per second, still nothing. Then at 60, the deck began to hum. At 65, it began to twist violently. A resonance had appeared. A specific frequency of wind, striking the deck at a specific angle, was pushing energy into the structure, faster than the structure could dissipate it. The model, inside the wind tunnel, began to tear itself apart. The room went silent. If the full-scale bridge behaved the same way, the entire project was at risk. Millions of yen and tens of years of work would face a public reckoning. Engineers worked for weeks. The real reason lay in an unlikely source. Small triangular fairings welded along the underside of the deck would disrupt the vortex pattern that fed the resonance. They were called stabilizer fins, and they worked. In the wind tunnel, they eliminated the oscillation completely. On the real bridge, they were installed before opening. To this day, they remain among the most important pieces of steel in the entire finished structure. The final numbers, when they were tallied, defied comparison and rewrote every record book Japan had kept. The longest of Japan's outer island bridge systems stretches nearly 90 kilometers, combining decks, viaducts, and connecting roadways. Central spans exceed 1,900 meters. Steel used in a single project can approach 700,000 tons.
Cable wire, if unwound and laid end-to-end, would wrap around the equator several times over completely. These are not metaphors. These are engineering realities documented in the technical literature of modern Japanese construction. Then came opening day. On some bridges, the first weekday after inauguration, total traffic stayed under 3,000 vehicles. On a typical urban expressway in Tokyo, the same figure would be reached before 9 in the morning. The cost per resident, when calculated honestly, worked out to tens of millions of dollars for every citizen served. The global engineering community reacted with admiration and disbelief. Papers were written, awards were given, quiet questions were asked. Was this engineering genius or catastrophic madness? Yet within a single decade, the entire verdict flipped completely around. Because the bridges began doing things nobody had officially planned for. Offshore wind developers wanted stable coastal sites. They discovered the outer islands, now connected by highway, were ideal. Turbine components could be transported by land easily. Components assembled at coastal staging areas installed in the shallows. Wind farms rose within a few years of opening. Shipping companies began routing container vessels through the newly monitored straits using Coast Guard infrastructure the bridges enabled. Fisheries protected by clearer maritime jurisdiction recovered. The bridges had redefined Japan's maritime exclusive economic zone completely. This achievement no diplomatic conference could have achieved. Neighboring countries protested. International courts declined to intervene entirely. Physical presence had, once again, defeated legal argument. The islands were now permanently, undeniably, unquestionably Japanese territory, and the ocean around them, for a radius of 200 nautical miles, was now Japanese as well.
This is the answer to the headline question. The bridges were never truly about the island itself at all. They were about everything surrounding the island: the water, the seabed, the fisheries, the wind. The bridges were the field infrastructure of a territorial claim, more than construction. By any reasonable calculation, the claim was worth hundreds of times what the bridges themselves had actually cost taxpayers.
The secret lies in a way of thinking about time that is deeply unfamiliar to standard Western planning cycles. A 4-year political term cannot justify a 30-year bridge. A quarterly earnings report cannot justify a century-scale asset, but a state that thinks in generations can. The engineers and ministers who launched these projects understood something profound. They knew they would never personally see the works finished. They accepted this reality. They planned entirely for it. They wrote their names into stone, knowing that other names would replace theirs before any ribbon was ever cut. And yet the story is not over. Japan is quietly planning the next generation of impossible ocean crossings now. Japan's Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism has published preliminary studies for even longer, more ambitious crossings. Some would connect islands so remote that current bridge technology simply cannot reach them across the deep ocean.
Engineers are studying floating tunnels, suspended from surface pontoons and anchored to the seabed by long steel cables. Others are studying modular caissons that could be assembled at deeper water than ever before attempted in history. Others still are studying self-healing concrete that could double the useful life of any marine structure built today. Climate rise reshapes every calculation. Sea levels will measurably increase within the lifespan of the next generation of bridges. Storm intensity rises, wave heights climb. Engineers designing today's crossings must plan for weather that has not yet happened. Every foundation is built taller, every deck placed higher, every cable specified stronger, tuned for the coming century. What was over-engineered in 1980 is now the baseline. Yesterday's margin has become today's required minimum. Maintenance economics of aging bridges are becoming a science of their own. Robots crawl along cables, checking for corrosion.
Drones photograph every square meter of steel yearly. Embedded sensors report deck stress in real time to central stations. One bridge generates more engineering data daily than the entire 1960s Japanese construction industry produced in a decade. The bridges have become, in effect, living laboratories. The 30-year bet teaches mega projects not simply that patience pays. It teaches that infrastructure is politics made permanent. The geography of a nation can be rewritten with steel. An empty island, connected properly, is no longer empty. It becomes a beacon, a claim, a foothold, a promise. And the value of that promise, extended across generations, can exceed any cost recorded on any ledger. The lessons are already studied elsewhere. Coastal nations from Europe to Southeast Asia send delegations to walk these bridges. They interview engineers, inspect maintenance records. Some of what they learn will surface in projects not yet publicly announced. Some will surface in doctrines not yet written. The blueprint for the next century is already being drawn. And it is drawn in Japanese steel, over Japanese water, connecting islands that most maps still label almost empty. Almost, because the emptiness was always the point. An empty island, properly connected, is not an absence. It is a possibility. It is a line on a map that another country simply cannot cross. It is a fishing right, an energy right, a shipping right, and a security right all at once. And the bridge, that impossible bridge over the impossible strait, is what makes that possibility finally real. If you were surprised by the strategy hidden inside these engineering decisions, the channel has more films waiting.
Films about how humanity outbuilds nature, how nations quietly rewrite geography, how longest gambits reveal their meaning. If the future of maritime megaprojects interests you, the next film is already waiting for your attention. Subscribe to continue the exploration. The story of how